Hi, everyone. Good to see you. I'm Derek Thompson, staff writer at The Atlantic. Welcome to Work in Progress Office Hours. Today's topic is remote work, the state of hybrid work, and the degrees that remote work could change U.S. economics and the geography of opportunity in the U.S. We're going to talk about how it's working out for workers and what the most interesting spillover effects and implications of this new technological revolution really are. We are joined today by Amanda Mull, a staff writer at The Atlantic, and Adam Ozimek, who is an economist and one of my favorite commentators on the issue of remote work. And whenever I have a big question about how things are working out from a macroeconomic standpoint, I always reach out to Adam to enlighten me. So welcome to both of you. Welcome to everyone who's here and is joining. And yeah, let's jump right into it. Amanda, first question is for you. You have written a little bit about remote work and hybrid work. You thought about this over the last 2 years, 2.5 years. We were just talking about some of your wonderful trend pieces for The Atlantic, including your expert summary of the state of global candy versus the quality of American candy. I'm really interested to know what you've changed your mind about over the last 2.5 years, because it's been a chaotic experiment for a lot of people and a lot of different companies. Surely we, had certain preconceived notions about how remote work was going to work out in March 2020 that, almost certainly can't be the exact same ideas we have about remote work now. So talk to me a little bit about what you've learned, what's really surprised you about the evolution of remote work over the last 2.5 years. And you are muted.
What a way to start. First, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Excited to talk about this. But I think that the thing that I've changed my mind about the most is just sort of my overall bearing on the subject and how I think about like remote work as a part of life, as a labor issue, as a force of social and economic and cultural change. I worked remote for most of my career before starting at The Atlantic. So this is a topic that really hits close to home. And, my initial thoughts on it were that remote work was good for me in some ways, but like in probably what I felt were more important ways, it made me sort of miserable, especially at the beginning of my career. And I felt like it held me back and for some ways that were likely replicable across sort of people of that age cohort if everybody sort of in it ended up beginning their careers at home. And I still think that is true. I still think that is the case, but I have sort of softened my view on how that can best be ameliorated, I think. Mm-hmm. Because I have been working from home now again for the past 2.5 years, basically. And I think that, the problem of commutes, the problem of, urban housing and how expensive it is near the best jobs, all of those problems, I think, are compelling problems that can't necessarily be fixed by remote work. But I think that the way we talk about where people should work and what the purpose of a workplace is needs to account for those things in ways that sort of recognize that they are a very real sort of like quality of life trade-off for workers. And I think that also something that I've been thinking about a lot in the last year is the sort of the social implications of the workplace and what we get or don't get from sort of like everyday necessity of traversing, parts of our cities or our towns and going from one place to another and being around a different set of people for hours of the day than we are in our home lives, and just like what that means for people and what's good about it and what can be improved about it.
Yeah, Adam, to you, and why don't you unmute yourself now? There you go. So, I know we've talked a lot about how optimistic you are about remote work writ large as an aggregate force in the economy. You're not some totalitarian who thinks that we need to ban offices and everyone needs to work remotely forever. I know that we've talked about the fact that there's sort of, one can imagine a sort of distribution of tasks, some that are like best done in person, some that are best done remotely. There might also be like a distribution of psychological preferences. Some people who really get a lot psychologically from the office, and others who are a little bit more internal, a little bit more introverted, and get more just from being alone and being able to work in private or in isolation. Talk about why you personally like remote work, why it works for you, and identify for me the sort of people who, in your discussions and research about this, it doesn't work out for as predictably and as universally.
Yeah, that's a great question. So for me, a lot of it has to do with sort of the importance of having a wide labor market reach and being able to live where I want. So I live in central Pennsylvania. Where I live, there's not a lot of jobs for economists, and being able to work remotely has allowed me to work for an employer in Philadelphia, an employer in San Francisco, and now the Economic Innovation Group, an employer in DC. So my labor market has essentially been the entire United States for my career. And I don't even know what I would be doing if I had to find an economist job in Lancaster. I probably wouldn't be an economist, or I guess I wouldn't be living in Lancaster. And, living here provides me with a lot of opportunities. I've started small businesses in the area, built a family in the area. So that increase in choice, that disconnect between where you live and where you work, I think is very powerful and very important for some people. Now, for some people, where they live and where they want to work is going to be the same place, and for them, it won't matter as much. But for a lot of people, it's not the same thing. The things they want in an employer are not the same things. Location are not the same things that they want in geography. So I think that is really important. The people who it's going to work out least well for are those jobs where you need that in-person connection. And it's funny how across industries you get some disagreement about what that constitutes yet. I think compared to a lot of people, I do think that in-person education is relatively important. Not for everybody, right? We could still end up with, 5, 6, 7% of students being remote, and that would be a huge deal. But I do think for the most part, the education sector, there's something about being in person that's very helpful for a lot of students. I think that the finance sector seems to believe pretty strongly that there is a very important in-person component there. So I think sometimes it's a sales thing. There's a sales aspect that's important in person. Now, whether a job when the sales aspect is important stays remote, a lot of that depends on the power of who sets the meeting, right? Because I've heard from people who get stuff sold to them, and the salesperson might want to be like a B2B salesperson might want to be remote because like when I'm in person, I can do a much better job upselling them versus the client who's like, I don't want to waste my day as much. I can hop on a Zoom much faster. It can cycle through these sales calls faster. So I do think that there will be more sales, more finance type jobs that are going to tend to be in person for that, but that won't always be the case.
Yeah, I do think that the psychological spectrum is really interesting to me. I know anecdotally, Amanda, this may or may not jive with your experience. I have a lot of friends who are classic introvert writers. They do not like being around people. They consider people to be a kind of like emotional terrorist in their lives, especially like in the office. Like they have friends, but when they work, they really, really want that experience to be extremely private. And I have friends who are extreme extroverts, and not being able to be in the office and tell jokes to people and get laughs in response to those jokes has been a real tax on their sense of identity, especially before offices started to repopulate. I know another spectrum that I've talked about with you is the age distribution. The Stanford economist Nicholas Bloom does these surveys of thousands and thousands of people, and he asks them all sorts of questions about their experience with remote work, including the question of would you like to be in the office 3 or more days a week? The group that is least likely to want to work remotely right now are people in their 20s. And that is something that was predicted by you. I think you wrote an article either last year or maybe it was relatively early in the pandemic in 2020 about how you foresaw that remote work might be a particular challenge for young people who aren't folded into a company culture, are introduced to a company that is a de facto group chat, and they don't know where they belong. They don't understand the cultural codes of that. Tell me a little bit about how you're thinking about this now, whether you still believe that remote work, as it's often practiced by many companies, presents a particular challenge to young people.
Yes, this is one of my favorite subtopics within this larger conversation. And I wrote an article about this pretty early on. This is one of the first things that I wrote during the pandemic period, I think. And it, I had this experience 10 years ago when I was, or more than 10 years ago, getting a little old, when I was starting my own career. I worked for largely the first 8-ish years of my career remotely. And, there was nothing about my job that couldn't be done remotely. I did very well at my actual work. But the sort of immeasurable stuff that we need to do to have a career, that was all much harder. It's very difficult to do sort of the soft skills of office work, which are very much like an important part of work in this sort of like sector of or tier of the workforce. The sort of learning about how to navigate office politics, learning how to navigate relationships with coworkers, learning the sort of like fine-grained social stuff of an office, which there is just a ton of in office work. That is very much a big part of a lot of these jobs is learning how to read the subtext of a meeting, how to pick up all of these things. And these are very difficult skills that are honed over time, and how to sort of play these skills in order to shape a career in the way that you want it is very, very important for these types of career arcs that we have for people who do office type work by and large. And if you don't have the opportunity to sort of like get a like firm grounding in like how this works, and even in an individual job to sort of like see how things are sort of put together in front of you and see what kind of hierarchies you're dealing with, see even just like who sort of like doesn't like each other, who does like each other, who is maybe like the person that you should trust to ask the sort of like indelicate questions about while you're trying to figure out a new workplace, is very, very difficult to do without sort of like being able to read the in-person vibes, not being able to see body language, not having a tone of voice all the time to go off of. And the beginning of a career, your early 20s to your mid 20s, is such a fertile time for sort of picking up this information and learning how to implement it in your own life, that I think that it can really set people back, as long as the jobs that these workers are going to have these expectations and these office structures going forward. And they may not eventually, but I think for the immediate future, a lot of the expectations in these jobs are going to remain rooted in how people have always behaved in them, even if they suddenly become remote permanently or hybrid. So I think that this like sector of the workforce, this like age tier, is just sort of behind the 8 ball in having this set of expectations and largely not a great opportunity to like learn how to fulfill them. And I think that that can have a lot of personal financial consequences, a lot of career advancement consequences, probably a lot of consequences in how people learn how to do the work that they're doing itself, not just the soft skills. So I remain really worried about that.
Adam, I'd love to know how you'd respond to Amanda's worries. 2 things that occur to me that you might be able to comment on are, one, I suppose that managers and companies can have sort of structural responses to these problems. They can find structural ways to change their workflows to make young people feel more braided into the culture of the company. Obvious must be said, one of the ways to deal with that is just to force everyone back to the office. Not necessarily the best way to do it, but that is one way to do it. The other thing that I know that you're interested in, I'm interested in it as well, is the fact that we're in the first inning of the technological revolution. And it's possible that just as Zoom is imperfect because, I need to remember to like look at the camera up here, even though your faces are technically down here, we're in inning 1. And just as like today's iPhone is a lot better than like the 2004 BlackBerry, in the same amount of time, let's just say, 17, 18 years between 2004 and 2022, by 2040, in another 18 years, we might have the same kind of advancement in the space of remote work tools. And so possibly some of the things that will make young people feel more involved, or remote work people feel more ingrained into their company culture, will be the fact that the technology itself is just so much superior. So maybe respond to Amanda on both those fronts, the managerial front and the tech front.
Yeah, I think that it is important to think about how early this is, because there's technological response and there's managerial process responses. And just like we saw that remote work pushed a lot of firms, we can argue about how many, but it's certainly a lot of firms were pushed to a new way of working that they didn't embrace before, but clearly we now know they should have. It sort of indicates there's a lot of inertia around processes, management processes, the way work gets done. And so you have to think about what are the other inertial processes that may change in response to this. I think one big one is the existence of this sort of like informal knowledge at work. Amanda talked about the need to you got to kind of talk to people, like pull them aside, like gather this informal knowledge. Like that sounds pretty inefficient to me, right? Like this knowledge, that what you need to excel at the job should be formalized. It shouldn't be a matter of, talk to so-and-so, they might know this or they might know this. Like firms need to move towards more formal knowledge capture, more formal knowledge sharing, and like to take these processes and remove them away from the informal into the formal, into the written. And I think that will actually pay dividends for a lot of companies making those changes, to take things that because stuff gets lost in that process. And also it can be very exclusionary, right? Because like one thing we know is that managers have a tendency to hire people and promote people like them. And people are much more comfortable getting information and passing information to people like them. And so sometimes what we feel as like, I'm more effective when I'm in person, or like I'm better at getting ahead when I'm in person, or I can, work this system better when I'm in person. Like some of that might be the feeling of having privilege, right? And the feeling of you being more similar to your manager than other workers are, in ways that are, a problem, and not the sort of thing like, we need to bring everyone back in the office and stick to the old way of working because, this is how, a bunch of white guys feel like is the easiest way to get ahead, right? So I think that like this evolution of processes is going to deliver a lot of dividends for the workplace.
I can't blow up my friend's spot here, but I have a close friend who I was talking to at a weekend several months ago, who works. He works in a big consulting firm, and he was talking about how it was really difficult to onboard young people these days. They're having a lot of problems bringing in young workers who are 22, 23. They didn't know how to do certain things in Excel. They didn't understand certain workflows, didn't understand certain sort of cultural expectations of like what the PowerPoint should be when they hand it off to their client. And I said, well, do you have this written down somewhere? Do you have like a playbook that you can just press send and email it out to them? And he said, well, no, we don't, because we've always just done this kind of thing in person. And I said, well, of course that it's going to fail if you're not having them in the office in person. But what if you try to turn it into a playbook? Like maybe that would be as successful, maybe even more successful, because a lot of people, it turns out, are better at setting a playbook than learning on the fly while the boss is screaming over their shoulder. And so, I'm not going to say the name of the company or my friend, because, he's trying to figure this out like everyone else. But that seems to be kind of like what you're suggesting, that there's a lot of companies that just felt nice and settled about the way things are, the way we do business when everyone's in office. But just because that's how they were doing it for years, decades, over a century, doesn't mean that's at all the best way to pass knowledge from the managerial set to the youngest workers. Maybe you just write it down and send it to them. And maybe you have some meetings, online, offline, about how exactly things go. But the formalizing of that knowledge, the writing of it down, does seem really, really important to me.
Yeah. And I'm a think tank economist now, but I've spent my life in the private sector for the most part. I've been at a forecasting company, I've been at a tech company, I've been at a consulting company, and across the spectrum, there is loss of knowledge due to a reliance on informality. What happened on this project back then? Well, you better hope that person who was on it still works here. Like, that's so unsatisfactory. Like, we're in the digital age, everything's being reported and kept. We should be, firms should have librarians, to be frank, to be capturing the sort of knowledge that's supposed to build over time.
That's great, Amanda.
That is something I absolutely agree with. It has been, like, throughout my career, sort of shocking to me how much that should be formalized and should be, like, easily referenced is just sort of done informally, and you have to find the person to tell you about the thing if you want to know about the thing. Even in very, very large businesses, I absolutely agree that that's hellaciously inefficient, and it is a needless roadblock to hybrid work, to remote work, to giving people, like, flexibility that they should have. What I think is a little bit more difficult than that is the fact that it's really hard to, I think, get around the fact that a lot of workplaces and a lot of types of jobs are just sort of also social spheres. We can do a lot to formalize and streamline and make more efficient the actual work of a job, the stuff that's in the job description. But I think it is hard to formalize a lot of the other interactions that can be sort of helpful in learning how to operate in a new social environment. And I know that a lot of people are sort of rightfully resistant to looking at the workplace as a place where people are in a social environment. But I think that humans are just sort of fundamentally social creatures. And a lot of the interactions that are most easily had in person are the types of things that are sort of fundamentally not documentable. Like the bonding with a coworker over some, like, wild thing that your manager said in a meeting, and you just need to, like, pull someone aside and be like, did you hear that? Did I hear that correctly? Why are we doing this? This is dumb. And those types of interactions, I think, can be really valuable to people, can be really valuable to organizations, can sort of, especially in work where people work on teams, where people are sort of, like, all contributing to, like, a greater goal or a greater project, that can sort of knit you to the people around you in ways that I think are valuable and that are sort of like fundamentally not documentable and not sort of made efficient. And there are probably technological fixes that can help some of this. But the fact that humans are people who just exist on a physical plane and experience things primarily on a physical plane is one of those things that I haven't quite worked out how to get around in some of this,
Yeah. We're going to get to some of the more global implications of the remote work revolution in just a second, but we got a question that comes directly from our listeners. I believe Tammy Bamani, I'm sorry if I mispronounced your first name, asks, is there anyone who's doing a good job teaching early career people some of these soft skills of work, like companies that are doing a good job using Adam's language here, sort of formalizing previously informal cultural information? Adam or Amanda, any examples that jump to mind of companies that you know of that have changed their processes in this way?
I don't know about companies that have done it, but if I make a modest proposal, I think when students graduate from high school, we should consider sending them away to institutions for 4 years that can train them on all sorts of skills that are provide them with generalized knowledge and soft skills for the workplace. I would say we could take 4 years to do that. And if we can't teach them those soft skills they need in 4 years, if that's like all that they're doing, like a 9-to-5 job, and we're drilling them with soft skills and general knowledge, then that sounds like we're probably failing at that hypothetical thing we might do. Let's call it college. That's where I think we should be re-indexing on skills that we're not, we may be learning less so in the workplace.
Amanda, how do you feel about the invention of something called college?
I really agree with Adam on that. I think that that we probably don't appreciate college enough as sort of an opportunity to build like a functional person, so much as we look at it as an opportunity to teach people like particular things in particular disciplines. And I think that college is really both. And like something that I love to joke about is that I went to a party school, go Dogs, and the most important thing that I learned in college, I think, is that I learned how to sit at a bar and drink with friends and order a drink like an adult and do these sort of like soft skills things. Like I learned a lot about the social world in college because I went to a highly social school. And that has helped me perhaps more than anything in the workplace, is just being like a person who can go to happy hour and handle themselves, and a person who is comfortable chit-chatting in those situations. And I think that college as a location in which people learn like the discipline that they want to work in, or more about knowledge in general, plus all of this other stuff about being a human in the world, is like exactly what college should be for.
Adam, I want to talk a little bit about some of the macroeconomic effects. Nick Bloom, second time talking about him in the podcast, come up with this phrase, the donut effect, which described the fact that remote work was having this outcome of hollowing out the home prices for a lot of downtown areas as people moved to the suburbs. And so home prices tended to accelerate more in a sort of donut-shaped a circle outside of downtown areas across the country, most importantly in America's biggest cities. We've also seen some transplants from big, dense, expensive cities to less big, less dense, less expensive cities, which our mutual friend Connor Sen, I believe, called Zoom towns, the sort of new 21st century or 2020s boom town. Tell me a little bit about where that phenomenon stands right now. Are we still seeing the donut effect? Are we still seeing Zoom towns?
Yes, the short answer is yes. We're still seeing the implications of remote work and economic geography. You can still see the donuts. You can still see the Zoom towns. One of the things that has helped a lot of big cities adapt to this, and one of the things that makes it harder to sort of see these effects unless you're studying them carefully, is that we're in a booming housing market. And so it's very easy for people to say, well, look at the New York City housing market. How can you say that this is a city that's being negatively affected by remote work? But, there's just strong household demand everywhere. And part of that is also remote work, because if you are going to be a remote worker a couple days a week, like, you want more space in your house. You don't want to live with a roommate who's also going to be buzzing around the apartment all day while you're trying to Zoom on meetings. So remote work has increased the demand for housing. You also had, a lot of stimulus that increased the demand for housing. And so like all those things push the housing market up. So what I think is happening is in some of these cities is it feels like things are like doing fine, but in reality, they've still lost population. It's just that population there is demanding more housing. So roommates are sort of moving out with each other. People are forming new households. In the long run, a smaller population base is going to have negative repercussions on your tax base. It's going to have negative repercussions on your consumer spending. And, in the downtowns, especially, they are definitely feeling that already across, the cities that are tracked by Castle, which is one of those, swipe card companies, still down like 40%. They're down like 40 something percent of the normal daily office traffic in downtown areas. So like the implications are definitely still there. You just got to look through the noise of the crazy housing market.
Amanda, have you seen this in New York? That, I live in Washington, D.C., and frankly, spend a lot of my time in the neighborhood that I live in Washington, D.C., so I don't go downtown to the downtown area, mostly unless it's at night, where it's hard to tell if things are more or less bustling than they otherwise would be because people are still going to dinner. But I wonder, as you sort of move about New York, have you sensed that like the downtown areas, like the midtown areas, are a little bit more ghost towny than they used to be? And maybe some of that economic activity and bustle has moved out to the boroughs, whether it's the Bronx or Brooklyn?
Yeah, I definitely think that, just in my own experience in New York City, you see evidence of this sort of like reshuffling of population that Adam was describing. I live in central Brooklyn in an area that is like heavily residential and that has experienced like enormous demand for 1-bedroom apartments as people sort of like look to get away from their roommates. And thank God for rent stabilization because I'm still in mine. And you see just like sort of, I have lived in this neighborhood as an office worker, as a remote worker before the pandemic, and as a remote worker now. And the sort of like the population here during the day of people who like stay in this neighborhood during the day has definitely increased. And you see like businesses popping up to meet that need. You see a lot more like all day cafes. You see coffee shops with bigger footprints to have more people in there on their laptops during the day, things like that. Like even locally in, Crown Heights, Brooklyn, you see some evidence of how things have changed in the past few years. And then I think in Manhattan, when you go into the city during the workday, it really depends on like what part of the city you're in. New York is a city with a lot of different sort of like office cluster areas. And it really depends on whether those areas have like other things to offer besides like a concentration of office work. When you get to Midtown, there's just not like a lot to do. There's not like a lot of non-work reasons to attract people to that area. And it's definitely quieter. It's definitely, not recovered. There are definitely a lot of open storefronts where there used to be like delis or, bowl food places that are so common in New York office areas. But then like our new office, the Atlantic's new office is in Soho, and you go to that area and it is like teeming with people every day. The lines to get a salad, at the office worker lunch place are just as long as they were in Flatiron before the pandemic. And people are out shopping, people are out walking around, people are out enjoying the many different types of things that Soho has to offer. So I think it's really in those neighborhoods that were just like sort of single purpose, that you really like feel the difference in New York. And then in areas that have like, a lot to offer, areas that are mixed use already, you see like a much bigger return to pre-pandemic life.
We have questions coming in about, including one from Martin Davis, about this longer term shift where downtown office buildings are repurposed maybe to live in so that the downtown composition is different. There's already a lot of reasons to think that commercial real estate is in a short-term and maybe medium, long-term recession, depression, reset, whatever noun you want to put in there after the term adjective. Not only is it the Castle data that Adam mentioned, which shows that in places like San Francisco, New York, Chicago, Washington, D.C., the number of people swabbing into buildings is more than 50% down from where it was in 2019. But also you look at things like metro ticket sales or subway ticket sales. Those also, according to the Metro Transit authorities, are never going to recover to the levels they were at in 2019. I mean, they have to put out these statements giving a good faith estimation of what's going to happen the next decade. And all of them seem to be saying, we're never going to get back to the same level of ridership, downtown ridership in particular, that we had in 2019. Adam, what happens to office buildings in this future that seems very clearly to be coming into focus?
I think it depends on where we're talking about. If you're talking about in cities where the price of land, the price of building is just astronomical, those are going to have alternative uses, right? Like if you're dealing with, in a city where average rents are, or prices are $1,000 a square foot, you're going to be able to repurpose buildings into residential, uses, because there's huge gap between like, here's where the prices are and like here's what it costs to make the change. So that'll be like a lot of places in New York, I think, are going to be repurposed just fine. It's just going to be costly, it's going to be expensive, but at the end of the day, people still want to move to New York at some price, right? There's nothing wrong with New York that can't be fixed by falling prices from most people's perspective. Other places, they're going to struggle because, the cost to repurpose the building just isn't worth it right now. And so that's a big transition to make when you're dealing with basically like, in irreversible investment that's doesn't have an economical use. Those places are going to find vacancies for a while, and you're going to, have to wait until building owners have sat around and for a long enough time to give up. And that's a harder transition to make.
Yeah, you answered Lisa Jacobson's question, which just came in. We're getting a lot of questions right now. First one is going to be to you, Amanda, and then there's one from Scott Schieman, who I'm going to send to Adam. So first from Andrew Zhu, is for Amanda. Do you have any recommendations for people working remotely who would like to engage more on a social level with their coworkers?
Yeah, I think that that can be really difficult. and it sort of depends on whether you're working remotely, but in a city where a lot of your other coworkers live, versus whether you're working remotely at a distance in a sort of fully atomized workplace. If you are a person who's working in a city where a lot of your remote work colleagues exist, in my experience, at least at the Atlantic, the biggest barrier to people getting together to socialize is just like someone proposing it and putting a date to it and putting an activity to it. So I think that like if you're in a position where you feel comfortable taking that initiative, or you feel comfortable proposing it to somebody higher up the food chain who can maybe marshal the troops a little bit, then I think you should just go ahead and do that, because in functional workplaces, people I think generally do want an opportunity to like see each other in person and say hi to each other. It doesn't have to be like a drinking occasion. I know that those are not everybody's cup of tea and not appropriate for every workplace. And some people would say not appropriate for most of them, but I do like having a beer with colleagues. And so I think that like, if you have like a good idea, if you want to go bowling, if you want to like, something that can sort of, engender the sort of like nice social feelings that we get from just like being around people we have things in common with, whether that's work or anything else. And it doesn't have to be super common, but I think just doing this every now and then would probably help you feel a little bit more connected to people. If you are at sort of a distance from people, I don't know that I have like a good suggestion for that, because it requires a lot of to get people together in person would just require a lot of capital investment to have people moving around the country and to do schedules that would make that happen. I don't know if there's a great like technological fix for that exists yet. Zoom happy hours, Zoom socializing, I think we have all sort of seen the limitations of that. But hopefully this is something that that somebody out there with a good idea is working on that will come online in the years to come.
Adam, are you a person with a good idea out there who's online and can give us a good idea in the seconds to come about how colleagues who aren't necessarily in the same city can find, if such a thing is truly desirable, find some kind of social connection, or advice for people who are trying to navigate the fact that they used to rely on the office as sort of a corporate hearth around which they could do certain things. And now they feel like, oh no, like I've lost this really important aspect of my social life, and they've been struggling over the last 2 years to reconstitute it through whatever, texting friends for after 5 p.m. drinks.
Yeah, I think that for some people who had a lot of their social life tied up in their office, this may be a painful adjustment, but it's a chance for a rebalancing. And I don't think it's actually a very good thing to have your entire life tied up in the office. For one thing, we have the lowest rate, or we did before the pandemic, the lowest rate of job transitions that we've had in the history of the data. And that's a bad thing economically, to be tied to your employer and to just be stuck there because you think, well, this is where all my social ties are. That's unhealthy. I think that's unhealthy for individuals. I think it's unhealthy for the economy, frankly. We want people to feel free to change jobs. And if you are putting all of your social eggs into your workplace, I think that's going to create negative personal and economic spillovers. So there's that. I do think that
you're talking, by the way, as someone who's been at the Atlantic for 14 years. So I'm not going to take that too personally, but I am taking this to heart.
And then I do think that, for companies that do want to create that social connectedness, yes, doing the corporate retreat is expensive, but it's not more expensive than renting an office building, right? So if you decide to go remote, that is going to free up some budgetary space for the company retreats, the offsites, to get together in a, some mutually agreeable time zone and spend 3 days at a, hotel doing some bonding and stuff. Do that once a year. I think that is something that remote companies do tend to do, is they try to focus on the offsite. So do your socialization in a very concentrated and focused way versus let's just force everyone in the building every day and hope that socialization happens.
The most successful remote companies that I know are very aggressive about retreats. I think they absolutely understand that even though everyone is in their own room, house, WeWork all over the world, this is a truly international company, they have lots of retreats because of this understanding that people do have this need to sort of be with each other. It's good for psychological safety. It's good for trust. It's good for building that kind of that kind of teamwork that is often necessary to push through really complicated projects. Adam, a question for you from Scott is, when we talk about remote work and when we have talked about remote work, we've focused on what employees want or feel, but how do managers and directors feel about remote work? One of the ironies that I've seen is that if you look at some of the data, some of the studies, even some of the randomized controlled trials, it seems like remote work on net makes people who are, say, programmers or working in knowledge work just as, if not more productive. You would think that managers and directors would want their workers to be maximally productive. But if you ask managers how much they like remote work, they're much more pessimistic about it than workers. So it's almost like someone has to be wrong here. Like either the studies are wrong or the managers are wrong to distrust the findings of those studies. So maybe the punchiest way to ask this question is, who's wrong?
So I think that managers are definitely less positive about remote work than remote workers are, but that doesn't mean that they're not positive. So we did a study very early in the pandemic. I did one about asking managers how they felt it was going, and there was 32% thought productivity had gone up, 23% thought it had gone down. So there were more who thought it went up than went down. The biggest group was in the middle. But importantly, like, everyone was thrown into this experiment, right? And in order for remote work to be a big part of the economy going forward, everyone doesn't have to have found the experiment to have gone well. If only 20% of firms, 25% of firms, those managers think it went well, that's enough for a serious long-term positive effect of remote work. Now, Nick Bloom's data, he's found that management plans for remote working, their desired plans have gone up over time. So they've sort of been gradually coming along over the pandemic, higher and higher rates of planned post-pandemic remote work. But he still finds a gap. You know, workers want this much work, managers want this much work. And so there's two ways we're going to adjust to this. One is that managers who are right will, and their productivity is actually, higher in person, they're going to get back in person, potentially through attrition, potentially through a change in the labor force. You know, if the workers are wrong, then those workers are probably going to end up having to sort into different occupations and finding things that are a better match for remote. And the manager will be right, and then they're going to deal with turnover for a while, and eventually they'll have a bunch of workers who are comfortable coming in the office. When the managers are wrong, I think what might happen is those companies get replaced, or those managers get replaced. Like, if they are a high enough up person, and I think part of the problem is that, what made you successful in your career as a manager may become deprecated by this technological and cultural shift. And if you were the kind of person who glad-handed their way to the top and networked their way to the top, and their key skill in life is, what Hewlett Packard called management by walking around, right? Like going and talking to people. If that's your key to success in your career, and you got your way to the top that way, it's going to be very hard for you to recognize that that doesn't really work anymore. That's not a great fit for your industry or occupation. And so I think we might see incumbents replace those firms that just refuse to adapt because, leadership has a bias built of, their own personal narrative of their success.
Amanda, any last comments on the managerial director boss side of things, the degree to which they might have to adapt quite a bit in the next few years in order to sort of get to the same level that employees are at when they come to demanding remote work possibilities?
Yes. One of the things I'm most interested in about remote work and its like lasting impact is how it sort of like gives us an automatic ground on which employees and employers can sort of renegotiate their understanding of each other and renegotiate, what exactly employees feel comfortable demanding and how much exactly employers can extract from them. And I think that this has given us sort of an interesting opportunity to go, okay, so what is it that you want out of me? And what are the conditions under which I can do that best? Like, I have sort of seen this happen in my own job at the Atlantic, where, my editor asked me to come in on a particular day because he's going to be in town. And I'm like, well, do you want me to file the story you're expecting from me that day? Or do you want me to come into the office? Because if you just want me to fly through this draft and get this done, then I probably need to stay home. I'm going to waste a lot of time that I could be finishing this for you if I commute in, if I, go do the rounds and say hi to everybody. And I like going into the city and doing the rounds and saying hi to everybody, but it's sort of like we've been given this opportunity to do this sort of like explicit prioritization of like, what do you want from me, out of me in this job today? Like, what is more important? Because these things trade off in a way that, like, I think 3 years ago, it would have been very difficult to talk about this because we were sort of expected to do it all the time. And I think that an opportunity to talk about how these things trade off and like what it is that we're prioritizing and what the conditions under which those priorities can be realized is a great thing for workers. And the companies that do that best are, I think, stand to gain a lot.
I agree with that. That's great. Adam, Amanda, thank you guys so much. That's all we have time for today. We hope that you guys join us for our upcoming events. October 27th, we're hosting our Education Summit in Washington, D.C. And on November 3rd, we are gathering for People versus Cancer in New York. You can register to join virtually at the links that have been dropped in our chat. If you missed this office hours and you're watching this on YouTube, you can catch me again every second Tuesday of the month going forward, or catch up on our progress page, theatlantic.com/progress. Read more from me at theatlantic.com. Read more from Amanda. Follow Adam on Twitter. Follow him at EIG. And if you enjoyed this conversation and want more from The Atlantic, you can support our journalism by becoming a subscriber. Visit our website for more info. Thank you both, and I'll see you both very soon online. Bye.
Thanks, Derek.
Thank you so much.